Chapter 1. A Good Day for the Crows. Summer was fast asleep underneath the thick blanket of fresh snow that covered the plains of Moran. Old Han's warm breath heated his beard beneath the safety of his woolen scarf that masked the plumes of cloud emanating from his mouth. He blew his breath downward onto his chin to avoid sharp exhales into the cold morning air. His damp beard would immediately form tiny icicles once he unwrapped the scarf off his face. The snow had stopped, but the air itself was so cold that it could not help crystallizing into tiny dust motes that performed an annoying dance in front of his squinting eyes. He'd been crouched behind the rocks and the naked bushes for a while now, and the obstinate cold rising from the snow had already started working up through the empty burlap rice sack that doubled as his mat and occasional blanket when he was out in the wild. The cold wave had conducted itself through his kneecaps, making its way up to his thighs, where the heat from the muscles of his legs had come to greet the slithering cold. Stifling his breathing usually took more out of him than the crouching and the waiting. The worn fabric of his winter jacket stretched and resisted the constant rhythmic inflating of his rib cage and the expanding of his shoulders. Were it not for the piercing cold of the winter, he would choose to strip from the waist up and wait the arrival of the morning game in a more comfortable pose. If it were a summer morning goat hunt, he would have had to scale the steep rocky valleys to keep up with the animal's superior climbing skills. If it were a spring deer hunt, he would have to constantly punch through the bushes in hopes of flushing a buck or a deer out into the open field. If it was any other season of the year, he might even have been patient enough to set up a snare and let the trap do the work for him. But with summer still months away, he knew exactly where he stood. He was young enough to be foolish, but too experienced as a hunter to be fooled into unnecessary adventure. He could not afford the time to set traps and wait. He could not afford to waste energy venturing outside his safety territory. Today, he had chosen to be patient and to let the game come to him. Despite the thick snow, water was in short supply on the plains. The long treks in the knee-deep snow meant deer would need to drink water more frequently, so instead of seeking them out, the safer bet was to lie in wait around one of the few unfrozen parts of the brook and have them come to you. Sooner or later, the deer were bound to show up for water, and when they did, he would be there waiting to ambush them with his rifle. He did not have the luxury of moving around or stretching his legs for fear of making the snow beneath him crunch. The tiniest noise could betray his presence. He made sure the river bank was not downwind of him. He did not have many trees, leaves, or long grass to help him read wind direction. This was a land of open plains, bushes, slabs of rock, unexpected valleys, and occasional hills. Trees were few and far between on the open fields of Moran. So, to keep track of the direction of the wind, he had learned to slow down his movements and control the rate of his breathing, paying close attention to the vibration of the minuscule beads of sweat on his face. The temperature difference between the different parts of his face allowed him to read the breeze. He had been fruitlessly staring into the not-too-distant horizon for the past few hours. He was starting to think that he might have to return to his cabin and come back after lunch when from behind the blurry white mounds a welcome shape appeared on the white canvas of the riverbank. His frozen finger was numb from stretching along the cold body of the rifle. He only knew where his finger was out of habit. The old stock of the rifle had a deep crack running through almost the entirety of its wooden length. When he pressed it firmly against his shoulder to assure himself of the rifle's heartwarming presence in his arms, it made a creaking noise. The deer was gracefully balanced on its thin legs as it walked slowly in the hunter's direction. She kept lifting the full sinewy stretch of her muscular limbs knee-high out of the snow and spearing them one by one back into the ground again. As she moved forward, her milky belly hovered over the fluffy snow. At times she dragged her warm body over a snow-covered mound or bush. Her eyes were wide open, and when her moist nostrils flared, they injected the morning air with wet life. Even though the rifle was old and had rusty days ahead, its iron sights were oily black. The barrel of the rifle stretched away from the hunter's eyeball and blurred out of focus as he allowed the deer to walk into alignment with the sights. He was willing to take whatever he could get from the hunt, but now that he had such a clear shot, he made a split decision to keep the deer skin intact and go for the headshot. This way, he would get at least two products out of his hunt, the meat and the skin. The deer stopped, flicked her tail and ears, twitched her nose, bobbed her head back and forth, and stood as silent and motionless as a figurine. The man ran his icy finger along the trigger guard. As his forefinger entered the space between the trigger and the trigger guard, sounds became muffled as if he were submerged in water. He no longer heard the flowing stream or the crows in the trees. His breathing slowed as if someone were sitting on his chest. He had very little time left before his thumping heart started sending shock waves through the body of his weapon, so he exhaled through a small opening in between his lips to release the pressure from within the frame of his rib cage. The stock dug into his muscles, and its cracked wood groaned. The deer swiftly swiveled her neck and looked the man dead in the face. As soon as their eyes locked, he squeezed the trigger. The deer's head whipped backwards with the impact of the metallic projectile, then immediately lashed sideways, as what initially resembled bright red silky goo sputtered, fountaining from in between the animal's eyes. Before the hunter could hear the explosive shot ring out and away from him over the expanse of the plains, he watched the rays of the sun shine through the thick spray of blood that spurted out of the deer's head. He had startled himself. Perfect timing. As he stood up and straightened his cramped limbs, fighting off a mild head rush, the animal's legs performed the final lonely waltz steps of death in the air. Even though the rifle had a strap, he laid it down by the rock and jumped over the bush towards the twitching trophy. He gripped the knife he had produced out of its pouch. The blade was short, but years of constant sharpening had thinned it down such that it was almost impossible for it to get dull again. Sharpness had become infused with the blade. The skin of the animal would not offer much resistance. The cloud of crows that had dispersed into flight after the blast of the gunshot were by now completing the full circle over the hunter's head. The birds were making sure the loud bang was not directed at them before settling back down on the branches of the sparse trees. As the cawing birds flapped overhead, the white expanse of the fields stretched out on all sides underneath them. Below, the human was hunched over a deer. When he stood up, The white sheet of snow around the deer's neck was stained with a crimson stain that grew in size, like a poppy slowly folding out its petals away from the deer's body. The human then pulled the deer by the hind legs, smearing a scarlet streak across the field.